Have you ever read a story in the Bible and wondered, wait, why did God do that? Imagine this. A man is afraid for his life. So he tells a lie. His wife is taken into the house of a powerful king. And then suddenly, God sends judgment upon the king and his entire household. But the man who told the lie, he walks away with his life, and even with more possessions than before. His name was Abram. The king was Pharaoh. And the question is difficult. Why did God punish Pharaoh instead of Abram? Was Pharaoh actually guilty? Was Abram innocent? Or is there something happening in this story that we often miss? Tonight, we return to one of the most misunderstood moments in the life of Abram. And when we understand what happened, we may discover that this story is not primarily about Pharaoh. It is about God's promise and what God was willing to do to protect it, long before he was called Abraham. Abram was simply a man walking by faith. God had called him out of his homeland. God had promised to make him into a great nation, and God had made him an extraordinary promise. In Genesis chapter 12, God said that through Abram, all the families of the earth would be blessed. But there was a problem. Abram had no child. His wife Sarai had no child. And yet God had promised that Abram would become a great nation. The promise seemed impossible. But Abram believed God. He left his country. He traveled through Canaan. He built altars. He worshipped. He followed. But faith does not mean a person never becomes afraid. And Abram was about to face a situation that would expose one of the greatest weaknesses in his faith. Then something unexpected happened. A severe famine struck the land. The land God had brought Abram into was no longer producing enough food. The man who had obeyed God now found himself surrounded by uncertainty. There was hunger, there was danger, and there was no obvious explanation for what God was doing. So Abram made a decision. He went down to Egypt. At first, this may sound reasonable. Egypt had food. Egypt was wealthy. Egypt could provide what Canaan could not. But there was another problem. Abram knew that Egypt was dangerous, and as he approached the country, his greatest fear began to grow. Not because he had no faith in God's existence, but because he feared what people might do to him, and that fear would soon lead him into a dangerous deception. Abram looked at Sarai. She was his wife, but she was also his half-sister, and Abram knew something else. She was beautiful. He feared that when the Egyptians saw her, they might kill him, so they could take her. So Abram came up with a plan. He told Sarai, "Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister." Notice what Abram was thinking. He was not simply trying to deceive people for fun. He was afraid. He believed that if the Egyptians knew Sarai was his wife, they might kill him. But there was a problem with Abram's plan. He was trying to protect God's promise without trusting God's protection. God had already promised to make Abram a great nation. But Abram was now acting as though his survival depended entirely on his own strategy. Fear was beginning to speak louder than faith. Abram and Sarai entered Egypt, and exactly what Abram feared began to happen. The Egyptians saw Sarai. They noticed her beauty, and word eventually reached Pharaoh. Sarai was brought before the Egyptian king, and Abram's plan began to work. But there was something Abram had not considered. The deception did not only affect him, it affected Pharaoh. Pharaoh believed Sarai was Abram's sister, so he treated Abram well because of her. Abram received sheep, cattle, donkeys, servants, and camels. The man who had feared losing everything was suddenly becoming wealthy. But while Abram's possessions increased, something far more serious was happening. Sarai was being taken away from her husband, and Abram's lie had placed Pharaoh in a situation he did not understand. Imagine Pharaoh's palace that night. Everything appeared normal. The king had welcomed Sarai. Abram had received gifts. The household continued as usual. But heaven knew the truth. God knew Sarai was Abram's wife. God knew the promise he had made to Abram, and God knew that something had gone terribly wrong. Then Genesis tells us something shocking. The Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues. Suddenly the palace was no longer peaceful. Something was wrong. The king did not understand it. His household did not understand it. But God was intervening. And this brings us back to the question, why Pharaoh? Why not Abram? Why didn't God strike Abram for lying? Why did the consequences fall upon Pharaoh's household? To understand that, we have to understand what God was protecting. Go back to the beginning of Abram's journey. God had said, "I will make of thee a great nation." That promise was not merely about Abram becoming rich. It was about a future nation, a covenant, a people, and ultimately, a blessing that would reach the nations. But there was one immediate problem. Sarai was the wife through whom Abram's promised family would eventually come. If Pharaoh took Sarai as his wife, the situation could threaten the unfolding of God's covenant promise. God had not forgotten his word. Abram may have forgotten to trust it, but God had not. And this is one of the most important lessons in the story. Human failure does not cancel God's faithfulness. Abram made a terrible decision, but God remained committed to his promise. But let's ask an even harder question. Was Pharaoh actually guilty? The Bible does not tell us that Pharaoh knew Sarai was Abram's wife. In fact, the entire story suggests that he believed the information he had been given. Abram's deception had hidden the truth from him. So Pharaoh was not being punished because he knowingly stole another man's wife. He did not have the complete picture, but that does not mean the situation was harmless. Sarai had entered Pharaoh's household, and God intervened before the situation went further. The judgment was not necessarily about Pharaoh committing the exact same sin as Abram. It was God's intervention to stop a situation that threatened his purposes. God was protecting Sarai. God was protecting the covenant, and God was exposing the consequences of Abram's deception. The plagues continued. Pharaoh finally realized that something was terribly wrong, and somehow the truth was uncovered. Imagine the moment when Pharaoh learned that Sarai was actually Abram's wife. Suddenly everything made sense. The strange afflictions, the disturbance in his household, the mystery surrounding Sarai. Pharaoh summoned Abram, and the confrontation was direct. "What is this that thou hast done unto me?" Those words must have struck Abram deeply. Pharaoh continued, "Why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife?" Abram had no good answer. He had created the problem. He had created the deception. And now a pagan king was confronting the man who claimed to follow the true God. Think about how unusual this moment is. Abram was supposed to be a blessing to the nations. God had told him, "In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." But now Abram's actions had brought trouble into a foreign ruler's household. Instead of being a blessing, his deception had brought fear and suffering, and Pharaoh knew it. That is why Pharaoh's question is so powerful. Why did you do this to me? The king was essentially saying, "You did not tell me the truth. I did not know. You put me in this situation." And then Pharaoh returned Sarai to Abram. The deception was exposed. The danger was removed. And Abram left Egypt. Pharaoh commanded his men concerning Abram, and Abram departed Egypt with Sarai. But notice something interesting. Abram did not leave Egypt empty-handed. He had become very wealthy. The very situation that began with fear had resulted in increased possessions. But there was a deeper lesson. Abram had learned that God's promise did not depend on his ability to manipulate circumstances. He had tried to save himself, but God had protected him. He had tried to control the outcome, but God had controlled the outcome. And perhaps that is one reason this story is recorded. Not to make Abram look perfect, but to show us something about God's faithfulness to imperfect people. Now someone may say, wait a minute, Abram lied. Pharaoh suffered. Abram became wealthy. Where is Abram's punishment? And that is a fair question. The Bible does not say that God directly punished Abram with a plague in this episode, but that does not mean Abram's actions had no consequences. He was publicly exposed. He was rebuked by Pharaoh. His deception failed, and he had to live with the reality that his fear had created unnecessary danger. More importantly, Abram's actions revealed a spiritual weakness. He trusted his own strategy more than God's protection. And Scripture does not hide the failures of its heroes. Abram is not presented as a perfect man. He is presented as a man learning to walk by faith. This is important. Abram had faith, but Abram also had fear. Those two things can exist in the same person. You can believe God and still struggle to trust Him in a frightening moment. You can know God's promises and still make decisions based on fear. Abram had already left his homeland because God called him. He had already built altars. He had already followed God into an unfamiliar land. But when danger appeared, fear took control. And that is why Abram's story feels so human. Sometimes we trust God when everything is going well. But when the famine comes, when the diagnosis comes, when the job disappears, when the relationship collapses, when the future becomes uncertain, we may suddenly start trying to rescue ourselves. But there is another beautiful truth here. God did not abandon Abram. Abram failed, but God did not cancel the covenant. Abram lied, but God continued working through him. Abram became afraid, but God remained faithful. This does not mean God approved of Abram's deception. Grace is not approval of sin. Grace means God remains faithful even when his people fail. And this pattern appears throughout Scripture. Moses made mistakes. David committed terrible sins. Peter denied Jesus. Yet God continued his work. The Bible does not glorify human perfection. It glorifies the faithfulness of God. So perhaps we should change the way we think about the story. Maybe the question is not simply, why did God punish Pharaoh instead of Abram? A better question may be, why did God intervene when Abram's fear put Sarai and his promise in danger? And the answer becomes clearer. God intervened because he had made a covenant. He had a purpose, and nothing, not even Abram's foolish decision, was going to derail that purpose. Pharaoh was caught inside a situation he did not understand, but God was not confused. He knew exactly what was happening, and he acted. There is another important detail. God did not merely protect Abram, he protected Sarai. Sarai was not a possession. She was a woman caught in a dangerous situation created by someone else's decision, and God intervened on her behalf. Before Pharaoh could take the situation further, God stopped it. This reminds us that God's intervention can sometimes look severe because he is preventing something even worse from happening. The plagues were not the end of the story. They were the warning, the interruption, the divine barrier. God was essentially saying, stop. And Pharaoh eventually did. Interestingly, this was not the last time Abram, or rather Abraham, would make a similar mistake. Years later, in Genesis chapter 20, Abraham again described his wife Sarah as his sister. This time, King Abimelech took Sarah, and again, God intervened. Abimelech had not known the full truth. God warned him in a dream, and Abimelech confronted Abraham. The repetition is fascinating. Abraham had already experienced God's protection in Egypt, yet later, he made a similar decision again. That teaches us something uncomfortable about human nature. Sometimes we learn a lesson, and then struggle with the same fear years later. Spiritual growth is often slower than we expect. In Genesis 20, God came to Abimelech in a dream, and Abimelech defended himself. Essentially, he said, I did not know, and God acknowledged that. The situation was different from someone knowingly committing adultery. Abimelech had acted based on incomplete information, yet God still required him to return Sarah. Again, the emphasis is God's intervention. God prevented the situation from becoming destructive. And once again, the foreign king was forced to confront Abraham about his deception. Abraham had God's calling, but Abraham still had weaknesses, and Scripture is honest enough to show both. Now we can return to the central question. Why didn't God simply punish Abram? The answer is that the Bible does not always record immediate punishment for every sin. Sometimes God corrects. Sometimes he disciplines. Sometimes he exposes. Sometimes he allows consequences. And sometimes he intervenes to preserve his purposes. In this particular story, God's immediate concern was not to destroy Abram. It was to rescue Sarai and prevent the situation from threatening the covenant promise. That does not make Abram's lie right. It shows that God's purposes were bigger than Abram's failure. There is another lesson here. We often see one moment and assume we understand God's entire judgment, but we do not know everything God knows. Pharaoh had his own kingdom, his own practices, his own moral world, his own responsibilities. The text does not give us a complete account of Pharaoh's character, or every reason God chose to afflict his household. So we should be careful. The Bible tells us what happened. It does not tell us every detail behind God's judgment. What we can say confidently is this: God knew the truth. God intervened. Sarai was protected. And God's promise to Abram continued. The deepest problem in the story may not have been the lie itself. It was the fear underneath the lie. Abram was afraid that if he told the truth, he would die. Fear told Abram, "You have to save yourself." Faith would have said, "God is able to protect you." And that conflict still exists today. Fear tells us to manipulate. Fear tells us to hide. Fear tells us to compromise. Fear tells us that God's promises are not enough. But faith says, I may not know what God is doing, but I know who God is. Abram had not fully learned that lesson yet. There is an irony here. God had promised Abram a future, but Abram acted as though God's promise needed his deception to survive. Have you ever done something similar? God tells you to wait, but you force the situation. God tells you to trust, but you manipulate. God tells you to walk honestly, but fear convinces you that honesty will destroy everything. Sometimes our greatest mistakes happen when we try to accomplish God's will through ungodly methods. Abram wanted to live. That was understandable. But his method was wrong, and God had to intervene. We should never use Abram's story as an excuse for lying. Someone might say, look, Abram lied, and God still blessed him. But that misses the point. God's faithfulness to Abram was not God's approval of Abram's deception. There is a difference between grace and approval. God can bless someone despite their failure. God can preserve someone despite their mistakes. God can continue using someone who has fallen. But that does not mean he calls the failure good. Abram needed God's grace, and so do we. One reason the story is so powerful is because Scripture could have easily hidden this. Imagine writing the history of your greatest national hero. Would you include the moment when he lied because he was afraid? Would you include the moment when a foreign king rebuked him? Probably not. But the Bible does. Why? Because the Bible is not trying to convince us that Abraham was perfect. It shows us that God works through imperfect people. Abraham's greatness was not that he never failed. His greatness was that he learned to trust God. And eventually, his faith would be tested in ways far greater than this. Years later, the same man who was afraid to tell Pharaoh that Sarah was his wife would face another test. God would ask Abraham to offer Isaac. And this time, Abraham would trust God in an almost unimaginable situation. The man who once tried to protect himself through deception would eventually become a man known for extraordinary faith. That transformation did not happen overnight. It happened through years of walking with God. Failure, correction, waiting, testing, promises, and grace. Abram was becoming Abraham. So what can Pharaoh's experience teach us? First, we should never assume that every difficult circumstance is easy to interpret. Pharaoh did not understand what was happening. Second, God sees what human beings cannot see. Pharaoh saw Sarai. Abram saw danger, but God saw the entire situation. Third, God can interrupt a situation before it becomes worse. And fourth, our decisions can affect people who never knew the truth behind them. Abram's lie was personal, but its consequences were not. One person's fear had entered another person's household. The most important lesson may be this: God's purposes do not depend on human perfection. Abram made a mistake, but God's promise survived. Abram became afraid, but God's plan survived. Sarai entered Pharaoh's household, but God's covenant survived. The situation looked completely out of control, but heaven was never out of control. And perhaps that is the encouragement someone needs today. Your failure may be real. Your mistake may have consequences. You may wish you could go back and make a different decision, but your failure is not bigger than God's ability to redeem. However, there is a warning here. The story should never encourage careless living. Someone might say, if God protected Abram after he lied, then I can do whatever I want. No, Abram's story is not permission to sin. It is a testimony of God's mercy. There is a huge difference. Grace should produce gratitude, not rebellion. If God has protected you from the consequences of your mistakes, that should make you more willing to obey him, not less. And there is something even bigger happening. Abram's story is part of a much greater biblical story. God promised that through Abraham's descendants, blessing would come to the nations. And centuries later, that promise would ultimately point toward Jesus Christ. The New Testament repeatedly connects God's promise to Abraham with the coming of Christ. The story in Egypt was therefore not an isolated family drama. It was one small chapter in God's unfolding plan of redemption. Abram could fail. Pharaoh could misunderstand. People could make mistakes. But God's redemptive plan continued moving forward. So, why did God punish Pharaoh instead of Abram? The Bible does not explicitly say that Pharaoh was being punished simply because Abram lied. Instead, Genesis shows God intervening because Sarai had been taken into Pharaoh's household, and the situation threatened the unfolding of God's covenant promise. Pharaoh appears to have acted without knowing the full truth. Abram was responsible for the deception, and yet God chose to intervene, not because Abram was perfect, but because God was faithful. That is the mystery at the heart of this story. Abram failed, but God remained faithful. Pharaoh was confused, but God knew the truth. Sarai was in danger, but God protected her, and God's promise continued. So perhaps the greatest lesson is not, why did God spare Abram? It is this, how faithful is God when his people fail? And the answer echoes throughout Scripture. More faithful than we deserve, more patient than we understand, and more committed to his purposes than our failures can ever overcome. If you have failed God, if fear has caused you to make a decision you regret, if you have tried to protect yourself instead of trusting him, remember Abram. His failure was real, but God's faithfulness was greater. And the God who protected his promise to Abraham is still the God who works through imperfect people today. Your failure may be part of your story, but it does not have to be the end of your story.